Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Good morning, afternoon to all of you who have joined. Let's give just a couple seconds just to give everybody a chance to hop on. But thank you all for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the webinar that we have today. I'm very excited about this one. We have a really great discussion about AI hiring and building an AI team. Thank you so much, Dave and Shane, for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and go. So just a couple housekeeping things before we go ahead and get started. So just so that you guys know, I'm Bailey Jost. I'm Content Strategy Manager at DICE, and I'm honored to be joined today with two wonderful panelists who I will introduce you in just a moment. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and go over some housekeeping things. So we are recording today's webinar, and we will send you the recording via email within the next 24 hours. Feel free to share the recording with colleagues, your team, or anyone else you feel may benefit from the information presented today. We created this webinar to be helpful to you and your hiring process. So we invite you to submit any questions that you have throughout the webinar to our panelists in the chat box, in the questions box, or in chat. And we will do our best to monitor those and get those questions built into the discussion. But just so you know, we will have a question and answer section at the end of the webinar for that to dedicate time to those questions. After the webinar, you will receive an email. Actually, I'm sorry, quick change to that. That we will have this quick survey that pops up at the end of the webinar. Please, if you have a moment, it should take no more than a couple minutes of your time just to submit some of your feedback and give us a sense of how you felt about today's webinar. That way we can provide quality content for you guys going into the future. So thank you so much for in advance for your thoughts. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce you all to our the guests that we have today. So we have two wonderful panelists on our webinar today, and I'd love to let them tell you a little bit about themselves. So Dave, I'll start with you. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Bailey. So my name's Dave Swegart, as the slide says, and I'm a one of our VP of developments here at DICE. And among other teams, I oversee our data science and AI team, as well as our data teams. And I've been here for about 5 years.
That is awesome. Awesome. Thank you. And Shane, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Bailey. So Shane Sawyer, Director of Development here in Dave's organization. I work kind of directly with the teams that are responsible for some large data ingestion pipelines, as well as the data science, machine learning, and ML ops.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. It's really great to have you guys here today. I'm really excited about the niche expertise that you offer to today's discussion, and especially as tech professionals in this space yourself, you guys have so much to offer to our audience. So I'm really excited to hear what you guys have to say. So before we jump in, I want to kind of give you all a brief overview of what we're going to be doing today. So today we set up a hiring scenario for building an AI team, and this scenario will give us a backdrop for our discussion. So remember, AI hiring is fairly new, and it's complex and situation dependent, as most things are, but especially right now, we're all kind of trying to figure out how to understand this hiring landscape. So our goal with this discussion is to help you determine where you can even start with your AI hiring process. We know that your hiring needs are going to be very specific to your situation and your business, but this kind of preview pretend scenario is designed to help you kind of get a landscape of what an AI team looks like. So after we've built out our AI dream team, we'll spend some time at the end answering some questions that you guys have that come up in the middle of this discussion. This is very much an unscripted discussion, and we're going to be kind of having this kind of off the cuff. So I want you guys to know that you can absolutely submit questions if you have them. So yeah, so let's talk a little bit about today's scenario. So we are, as you can see, in this scenario, we're we're starting with a medium-sized e-commerce company. We have enough budget to hire for 6 new roles, and we're considering this, 1,000 to 2,000 full-time employees, mostly a lot of them are tech professionals, but specifically, what is an AI team and how can that be used? So this team will be working on projects. We're not hiring them for a specific project. That might be the need that's sort of kicked off this process, but they will be involved in lots of projects going forward, all about designing, improving the e-commerce customer value experience, and whatever that looks like in this pretend organization. So before we get into the specifics of the scenario, Dave, can you talk a little bit about the questions technical recruiters would need to ask hiring managers to complete a project like this successfully?
Yeah, so we thought it might be helpful to go through a few things we think about when talking about, I don't know, broadly data science, AI, ML teams, whatever your flavor, whatever your company or companies that you're working with likes to call them. These are questions that this framework that I'm going to present, or these buckets that I'm going to present, are things that we typically run into when hiring. If we don't answer up front, you're going to be forced to answer these one way or the other. Whether it's up front or once the person starts, then they become somewhat unhappy on the team because maybe it wasn't exactly what they thought. So we thought maybe giving you some rough buckets of how to think about what a company is doing. And again, we'll apply that to our specific scenario here, but kind of zooming out and ignoring this specific scenario here, we thought there's kind of 4 broad buckets we think that people want to hire into. So the first one would be companies looking to build an AI an ML product team. So they have one or more specific products that they're looking to roll out or build or enhance, and they want to put together a specific team to address that need. And that's in the case of our hiring scenario here that Bailey was talking about, that's the scenario we're going to go with today. The other ones are enhancements to existing product teams. So maybe they're the company isn't looking to necessarily say, hey, we're rolling out a new product or a big AI feature. Maybe we're adding some intelligence to an existing product or something like that. We want to explore adding this into there. So you could the other scenario would be we're just looking to hire a couple folks onto an existing software engineering team, for example, to enhance the product or roll out a specific feature in some way. The next one is internal data team. So, or you could think of like an internal data science or AI team, something like that. That typically is folks that are focused on, what would maybe traditionally be called a number of years ago, business intelligence, right? People that are taking the data that these internal data teams collect and applying them broadly across the organization or surfacing in some way that multiple software engineering teams could get access to them. So this is kind of maybe, again, either you're hiring a few onto the team or you're building a bespoke data science team, but we'll call that bucket kind of internal data team. One thing I want to throw out there that does come up sometimes too is that we think would be important for recruiters to know is the term AI and previously data scientist, right, and machine learning engineer, like those tend to be used pretty liberally, and there's no official, right, there's a commonly agreed upon definition, but each company is unique. And so one thing that we see to watch out for is, is the company really just looking for like business analysts and data analysts, or are they really looking for like an AI and machine learning engineer? Because that fits important, right? If somebody, for example, is like, look, I've got skills in applying in building tools to leverage LLMs and software engineering skills, and they get in and they're essentially just assembling pulling data out of reports into spreadsheets or running some basic SQL on top of a data warehouse, they're going to be pretty disappointed with that. Right, but it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with that. It's the need the business has, but those are some differentiations we have. And then finally, you get into kind of the last bucket, which I'll call building AI and ML foundations. That's really what the big 10 companies, think Microsoft and Google and OpenAI, right? They're hiring people to actually build the tooling that the previous buckets I talked about are actually taking and applying in real life. So not going to talk through that here today. I think that probably makes sense. But did want to put those 4 buckets out there that we think through. And like I said, we're going to focus on that first one, which is the AI and ML product team in this scenario.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, thank you so much for that context, Dave. And as we're going through this, Dave is a lot of what Dave's voice is bringing to this conversation is how does this team fit into the broader organization? One of the things, one of the challenges that recruiters face when dealing with hiring managers is understanding enough of the technical needs and requirements of the team that they are hiring to find people who fit those needs. And that can be really complex. Dave or Shane, would you say that internal team members, who should they be going to for those sorts of questions? This is like the hiring manager, obviously, but who else would they be able to help answer those sorts of questions?
Yeah, I think it's good for them to. I mean, you talk to the hiring manager, obviously, but I think you have a really good point that the recruiter should know enough to be technical. Having been on the other side of this a lot too, you can get a lot of outreach from recruiters that it's clear that I'm not going to be a good fit, right? Because maybe a few keywords lined up, but they didn't. So I think getting an understanding from the hiring manager plus a few key people on the team, maybe say there's a lead or somebody that is considered the subject matter expert in that kind of role where they're looking to hire another person. I think it's important that you can have that conversation up front to make sure, as Dave said, like you're actually want a machine learning engineer, not a data analyst.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the way I look at it is in what we've done in the past successfully is you can either go up, you don't want to feel like you're going over somebody's head of like, oh, I don't value the hiring manager's opinion. But in some of my hiring managers, for example, we've gone up and said, hey, can you include, I want my director there because you're asking some questions that are about the broader organization, which is a good thing. But then once we get to the more specific side, like Shane says, right, we say, hey, can you bring a staff engineer on your team in or a lead to have that discussion because they can answer some more specific questions and say, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. Don't worry about that. Focus more on this area.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, great. And for this scenario specifically today, we chose to talk about an e-commerce company. Shane, you had some really great reasons for wanting to talk about this. So I would love for you to share some of those with the audience.
Yeah, sure. So I like this use case because I think that in an e-commerce situation, there's a variety of places where you can apply artificial intelligence and machine learning, but it's also pretty relatable. Like we all kind of understand what e-commerce is, right? So in this case, you could think of applying your machine learning to like sentiment analysis on your product reviews, right? Or you can analyze customer behavior and kind of understand how people are shopping, when they're shopping, and like, what kinds of things they're looking for. And you can start to do some predictive modeling around that, as well as you can start leveraging generative AI, the new hotness, to create better product descriptions. So a little bit for everybody, I think that is easily relatable here because this can be a very complex topic.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Okay, great. So last question about this scenario so that we make sure that we've set the scene correctly. We really chose to focus on the difference between creating and implementing AI. And there's going to be lots of different projects. Some projects are going to be creating a new model, and some projects are going to be taking an existing model and implementing them as part of your business. So Shane and Dave, can you guys talk a little bit about what are the differences there, and from a team size and budget standpoint, that would be helpful for this audience to understand.
Go ahead, Jane, if you want to start us off. I think you've had some good responses to this one, or I can.
So if we're talking about like which types of roles that we want to focus on here, I think that first I want to talk a little bit about the differences. As you said a little bit before, some of these roles are can be a little nebulous, and it's hard to tell based on what somebody's title was, right? So I think I would like to talk a little bit about like data scientist versus machine learning engineer and software engineer, right? It can be a little confusing, but that's probably because there's some overlap there. And I think the best way to talk about it is in what's the goal for that role. And for data scientists, it really is like these are the people that are going to be digging into the data, trying to find the actionable information through analysis, maybe building some models, right? They've got a really strong understanding in statistics and computer science. They're really trying to find the insights. What can we use in the data? What patterns are we seeing? There's a little overlap between that and machine learning engineers. I think you look at machine learning engineers in this industry, you'll find that they do have some data science background, right? They do a lot of analysis, but really their goal is let's take what's been found and let's create models that are scalable and we can put them into production and really get the value for the business out of those. That's where there may be a little overlap with software developers, as bringing these models to production, though. You want to have some software developers there to handle the things that you'll typically find when creating a product, whether it's providing APIs or authentication mechanisms, caching, things that you want to consider for performance and cost reasons as well. So I think with the three of those is what it's going to take to kind of build your core team.
That is great. So let's, I want to take a lot of what you said, Shane, and kind of build that into what we're going to be doing today. So what we're looking at here, what we have is this screen kind of just at its most basic level, who needs to be on an AI team, what sort of skill sets, what job titles, and how are they organized is what we're going to be talking about today. And what Shane just touched on a little bit is the difference in skill sets between a data scientist, a machine learning engineer, and a software engineer, which is, spoiler alert, kind of the core team for an AI organization. So let's start with really just like who would be leading. Oh, and before we go into this, I want to say a little bit about what we're seeing here with the roles. So we pulled these, the data that you're looking at here for salaries comes from the research and the survey data that we got from our 2024 tech salary report, which we released in January. I highly recommend, if you haven't looked at that yet, to check that out, because we have a lot more information there about the roles and the job titles and the salary expectations and the sentiments of people who are in those roles in tech in 2024 right now. So that's really useful for building these teams later. But just to kind of keep in mind, when we're looking at these salaries here, these are average salaries. There's obviously a whole range of people who have these kinds of core skills and job titles, with some of them with 5 years of experience and some of them with 20 years of experience. So there's obviously going to be a huge range there. So I just kind of want to call that out, that it is very much case by case, person dependent for that. But awesome. So Dave, who would you pick to lead a team like that? Assuming we have to go out and build this team from scratch, assuming that we don't have somebody already in the organization who could lead a team like that, who would be the right person for kicking this off and starting that process?
Yeah, so it's a good context that we don't. The assumption here is we don't have the manager of this team hired already. So yeah, obviously you'd want to look into getting that a manager of this team. And every organization is different, right? Some people call it lead, but in this case, we're going to call it, let's say, data science or AI and ML manager. So that's who you want to kick it off with first. And we debated some, and it depends on how fast the company's looking to hire. And we debated some about, like, do you hire the whole team up front, or do you hire the manager first and then hire everybody else? I think the ideal situation is hiring the manager and then getting them involved in hiring everybody else. Don't need to repeat all the statistics everybody already knows, that like most reasons people stay, or most reasons people leave a job, not stay at a job, are a manager, right? That's a majority of the reason. Isn't salary, it isn't other things, satisfaction of work, or like the job they're doing, it's typically manager. So it's very important. So I'd start with that person if you have the time, and get them in and then work with them to build the rest of the team that fits around that person, and that would be better. Okay, so in the case of hiring a manager, I think you can, especially when you talk about, and let's just broadly say this fits into the category of engineering management, right? This person, when we look at those folks, if they're going to be managing a larger team, let's say more than 8 people, typically a lot of that person's time is going to be more focused on managing, right? So that would mean that you're less probably focused on, can you log in and help assist the team building an ML model, or training a model or providing feedback or whatever, right? I think that's important regardless of the team size that you're on. But in the case of a larger team, right, maybe 8+ in this case, you might focus more on managerial skills, breadth of experience, things like that. In our case, we said we're gonna say 6 roles, so 1 manager and then 5 engineers broadly on the team, or 5 other people, because I think we have some ancillary support people that we want to talk about as well. In that case, we'd probably want to look for somebody who's a little bit more like a player coach, right? So somebody that has experience either recently or currently, right, deploying ML models or working with AI, right? They're more hands-on. They've written Python recently, or we're doing that, right? They know SQL, those types of things. You'll want to make sure that those skills are more front and center than you were if you had a larger team.
Awesome. So just to clarify, you're recommending that the person who leads this team has a lot of management experience, but also has their hands in machine learning.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I think management experience is obviously the most important thing, regardless. But I would focus. I wouldn't. I would be. The way to think about it is for a larger team, and again, this is organizational dependent, right? Some organization may say no, you're expected to manage 10 people and be a player coach. I'd argue that might be a bit much, but it depends on the organizational culture. But broadly, right? If you're like, hey, I'm managing a large team, it's like the recency or of currently having your hands on code and deploying models or whatever the remit of the team is going to be or was on the previous team is less important than it is if you're kind of more in the scenario we're talking about, which is the player coach, if that makes sense. So again, having experience regardless with these types of things are important, but I'm just, the person with a larger team is just going to spend more time managing people than they are actually, deploying code. And that's a good thing. I completely think that that's what they should be doing.
Yeah, okay. That makes a lot of sense. And I think, so to take what Dave just said, a manager who has some experience in order to like understand that most of their time is going to be spent managing the team. So they won't be hands-on doing the work themselves. Who then would be leading a lot of those work projects? Who would we need to have kind of as the key driver for this project or these AI projects?
Yeah, so for our example, we're leaning more on a little bit of the player coach. So we could 6 people total, including them on the team. I think you could rely on that leader manager to lead a lot of those projects. Though, this is where I'll probably allow Shane to dive a little bit deeper. But you're likely to want to have a more, regardless of how talented the leader is, like we talked about, typically management and managing people is their most important job. So, extremely technical projects that require a lot of guidance can fall by the wayside because you don't want, you want to tend to your people and make sure they don't leave. So in that case, you'd want to, even on our team here, you probably want to look at like a more senior, data scientist, machine learning engineer to help bolster the team and be that kind of lead or that right hand of the manager to help support them. I don't know if you want to go deeper on that, Shane, or tweak that a little bit.
Yeah, I think maybe add to it just a little bit. I think you're right. If the manager's going to have to focus more on the management side because he's got a larger team, you're probably going to want somebody that is stronger. I would say maybe more in the machine learning area rather than the data science. Though I think the important part with a team like this is that I think everybody needs to be pretty technical here. If you're trying to lead this team, everybody from your product manager to your manager needs to be pretty technical because I think we might touch on it a little bit, but this is an R&D heavy team, and you have to really understand how to bring those things to the product and drive that business value out of it.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. So either somebody who has touching machine learning or data science. Either way, though, we do need to have somebody in the team who has great machine learning experience and who can be really hands-on. We're going to need to have someone who is data scientist who has a lot of experience with that. And then the one that you guys had mentioned to me earlier is that software engineering would play a huge role in this. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I did mention that, and it's a good question, Billy. I think that if you're building models internally, you need to bring those to the market. Basically, you need to be able to provide a way for those to be accessible through the product, and you need feedback on those models. You need monitoring on those things, and then if you have a large enough team and you can hire ML ops engineers, that's that's a bonus, right? If your budget is limited to a smaller team, you maybe your software engineers would take on that role, similar to how they would maybe take on a DevOps role. You need to build pipelines to deploy these things, monitoring, retraining, gathering feedback, and then everybody's favorite topic now, the generative AI. Those things have become so accessible. If you can use things like ChatGPT or any of those models, APIs, software developers can implement those in the product as well.
Okay.
Yep. But even with the latest crop of let's just say ChatGPT or Claude or whatever model you want to say, if you really want to kind of get past the glossy 80, okay, this works in a tech demo, right? You do need to have feedback and fine tuning on those models, right? Or you need to have fine tuning, which means you probably need to have feedback and you need to expose it and have keys so that just the general public can't come out and submit a million requests to your system, right? Like, so you need some security, right? So those LLMs, right, have progressed significantly far and have removed a lot of stuff in this case, but still turning it into something that works for an organization does require a lot of wrapping and, like I said, like feedback mechanisms and things like that to make sure it's hitting the mark for what you want and monitoring. And that's where the software engineers can come in to help with that type of stuff.
Okay, awesome. And we in addition to the core team of people who are going to be like really critical to a lot of these projects, there's also the team of people who need to make them possible from an activation standpoint. And we've talked a little bit about how the software engineer is going to play a role in that. How many more people do you think? We currently have 4 people on this team. How many more people do you think we need to have in order to make this possible?
A big one for me is the product manager. And so from just working in kind of in the industry here, I've seen this AI product manager title emerge and becoming more and more popular. And then I don't think there's anything extremely special about that product manager in terms of AI, other than, right, that's the new thing, the new thing here. But the idea really that I think with these product managers is that they need to understand the life cycle of an AI or ML project, and they need to understand that there is a lot of R&D going into building your own models, and even using, as David said, these large language models. There's a lot of work that has to go into keep them from hallucinating and going off the rails and destroying your company's reputation. So I think that product manager needs to know enough about the technologies that they can talk with a team about it, but they can also align the work to the business objectives. Right? They understand that you can experiment, that this team is going to do experiments, and they have a good sense of when a product is viable for the business and when it's not.
Yeah.
I want to revert back or reference back to something. I was waiting for this to come up. Reference back to something Shane said earlier. He said this needs to be a pretty technical team. That includes, in this case, the product manager, and that may mean that they're on the more expensive side. But this is a complicated area right now. Even again, like I said, with LLMs, it's still relatively complicated, and it does require a talented person even to be the product manager on this. And two, with a smaller team, they may play some of that kind of QA UAT role for some of this stuff. Again, it doesn't mean they're writing Python code necessarily, but they may write some SQL, they may analyze some reports, things like that, and get into the weeds a little bit more with like feedback and testing out the functionality. And sometimes that does require them to be a bit more hands-on and technical. And in this case, again, we also have a little bit of a smaller team. So I think that is one thing we've seen become helpful in this area as well, is the product manager's ability to engage with the team at a little bit lower level.
Do you, you wouldn't have prepared for this question in advance, so sorry about that. But do you know what the difference between product managing an AI team versus product managing a different kind of technical team?
Yeah, I mean, we've spent Shane and I have spent some time talking about this, but if you're okay, I might hand that to you, Shane, because I think we've talked about this at length and you had some good responses. So I might let you go first and then I'll add some stuff to it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I touched on it a little bit, but since the team is really heavily focused on R&D, the product manager has to understand that this is research, right? If you're building these models yourself, this is research and experimentation. It is a science, right? And these data scientists and machine learning engineers will follow this kind of a hypothesis and experimentation routine, and they may not provide anything of value at the end, right? Maybe you learned that your hypothesis is wrong and there's nothing you can put into the product there. So that's one of the biggest differences I see is if you're a product manager on a kind of a software product customer facing team, right? You can gather requirements, you can do some QA checks on it, right? And you deliver something to production maybe behind the feature flags and you gather some user feedback. That may not be the case with this team, and your turnaround time on bringing something to market could be a long time, depending on how hard the problem is you're trying to solve, and how many of these cycles you need to go through with experimentation.
Yeah, I think Shane hit it. It basically the person needs to have the ability to be kind of that traditional product manager that we talked about, which I'll get back to in a second, but also at least up front be comfortable with a lot of experimentation, and that's versus like a lot of gathering of well-defined requirements. And it's not like they shouldn't be out there talking to customers, those types of things, but it's a very murky, weird area where the requirements may come from internal people, engineers, right? Maybe customers, and you kind of have to mix it all around in a pot and come up with something of like, here's my hypothesis, we need to test this, and then you need to make sure that it happens relatively quickly so that you don't waste time and on something that may be a bust, but you've spent enough time to actually rule it out or rule it in that case. And then as the team evolves though, and eventually, maybe has one or two things, let's say in our example, right, they continue on that path and now they're going to maintain and enhance those tools, then that person has to have the ability to switch over to kind of a little bit more of that classical product manager role where they can start doing some of the, like, okay, now we have the thing, now we want to enhance it more versus let's experiment and find something.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. That I think that really helps understand that. And would you say that, do you think that we would need to have more than one software engineer, machine learning engineer, or data scientist on this team? If you had if you could only hire one more person, who would you put on this team?
I lean towards maybe machine learning engineer, but I'm probably going to defer to Shane on this one, who he wants last, because I think you could argue that any of the three there under key drivers, you could use another one of any of those three depending on what you're doing.
Yeah, right. I think the key there, depending on what you're doing, what the product is, of course, the answer is always it depends. But I agree, David. I think the machine learning engineer, because that as you had them there, Bailey, into three roles, the machine learning engineer overlaps a little data science and then overlaps a little software. I think that's the person that I would hire in this case.
Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think especially depending on how much R&D is involved with these projects, it sounds like that person would be the most comfortable with that, or would you disagree?
I think your data scientist is the one that's solely focused the most on R&D. One thing that we haven't mentioned here as a support team member is like a data engineer. So if your company doesn't have a data engineering team, you're probably going to want somebody to help in that area, because the data scientists, machine learning engineers, they need good data to do the work, right? And they can go explore as much as they want, but if the rest of your company is bad data in, bad results, right? So
yeah.
I think a data engineer is also an important role.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I actually wanted to touch on that as well. Is something Shane just said there is like, if you don't have data engineers, it really depends on the remit of the team. So maybe the company has data engineers on an internal team. Depending on what this team is building, that may be sufficient. So it's like, well, they're going to supply all the data, we're good. In a lot of cases, these teams are like, actually, that's not going to supply all the data. That's going to be some of it, and we're going to capture more. We're going to need to collect more. or the experimentation, kind of the remit the company has signed us up for is a very data heavy thing, which a lot of these new tools or ideas are. And in that case, yeah, you would heavily want to consider putting a data engineer on there, because while data scientist, machine learning engineer, software engineer should be able to get around and do some light data engineering, in my opinion, once it gets into like a ton of data, that's where these people tend to provide a lot of value. So if you see it, that the project biasing heavy towards data and they don't have a strong data foundation at that company, it's something to consider for sure.
Okay, awesome. And can you tell me a little bit about the difference, just quickly, the difference between a data engineer and a data scientist, for those of us who do not know?
So I think with a data engineer, and this is my background is in data engineering, so this is all the love in the world. I think you're focused a lot more on plumbing, right? So you're focused on getting data from somewhere, putting data somewhere, structuring it, cleaning it, make sure it runs every day, right? So a lot of software engineering principles, but specifically applied to data. And a lot of the work is behind, or I should say, all of the work is behind the scenes. With a data scientist, again, we talked about the different 4 buckets at the beginning. It depends on what the remit of the team is. In the case, let's just take the case that we're looking at here. A data scientist would be more using the outputs that the data engineer has, plus maybe other stuff they've collected ad hoc to do analysis, apply statistical methods to say, analyze data and say, is this experiment going to net us something, or are the outputs of this actually coming out the way we thought they were, right? Putting together a lot of hypotheses and then testing those types of things, and then doing some analytics and like I said, maybe some lightweight data engineering, but mostly focused on that kind of like experimentation hypothesis area. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Shane.
Yeah, no, I'd say, I mean, that's it, right? And to put it in a nice, with a bow on it, is they're finding the story in the data.
Okay, that makes that great. Thank you. A couple other roles, and we only have a few more minutes, and so we don't have a lot of time to dig into these, but we've thrown around other titles that potentially would fit into this team. An AI ethicist in the case of a larger organization, someone who is working on creating a brand new model that would be used by a lot of consumers, would be potentially something that a team would need. We've also talked about having an ontologist, an AI QA engineer as well. Do any of those 3 roles, is there anything that you guys would like to add some color on, potentially why we would want to add one of those roles to this team?
No, the
Sure.
ethicist. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Dave. Yeah, you take that. I was going to take the others.
I think sure. Yeah, I think the ethicist is probably evident. When you start building these things at scale and a lot of people start using them, and it's not why we're saying use it up front, because I think that between the data scientist and maybe the manager, you probably have a handle on some of this stuff as you're exploring what works. But as you scale up and start getting a lot of daily users on it, and it starts producing results, depending on what your output is, right? And let's just maybe even take our example of Dice, right? Like hiring, you start looking at like, wow, this thing is recommending people for you to hire. Like, what sort of biases does it has? Is like, what is ethical? Like, are we recommending? Is that okay what we're recommending? And so they start, like I said, some of the folks on the team that we've already built here start to ask those questions, and in some cases can answer them. But once you start to use this at scale, that becomes unmanageable, and you want to be able to make these claims about your product. You want to be able to do these types of things and stand behind them. And that person could look into some of those cases and say, like, actually, yeah, this is doing what we say, or and isn't giving some unexpected result to people that you can't see.
Thank you. Okay.
I think that's a really, really good point. I wasn't going to talk about the ethicist, but I think David, you brought up a really good point about having that somebody to kind of look at these models and make sure that there's not bias being introduced there. And one of the ways that we could try and mitigate that is through diverse hiring in this team, right? Because I think that's going to become even more and more important as we've seen legislation start to crop up about accountability for people that are using models to make decisions. So we definitely don't want to be on the wrong side of that.
For sure. Awesome. There's a whole world of topics on that, and I think talking about AI ethics is definitely something we would want to come back to in another webinar. But we only have 1 more minute, so I just want to make sure. Thank you guys both so much for joining us today. I think this was a really interesting discussion and really helps build a foundation for where people should even start when they're building these teams. We have a lot more content that we're really working on trying to answer these questions for recruiters, and so we've been working really hard on answering some of them. Big report drop that we put out a guide last week, and this is something that you guys will all get access to when we email you a follow-up. But this is all something, more content about this, more about the skill sets, and we've really been working on this. So thank you all so much thank you all of you for joining. Really appreciate it, and we look forward to your feedback, and please do remember to submit a survey at the end. Thank you, and thank you, Shane and Dave.
Thanks, Bailey, and thanks everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Bailey.
Thanks.